I think I relate quite good to the first two talks of Brian and Kevin. I will be questioning the concept of ontology. Again, it's related to what Karen Barat does, I think, because she, with her agential realism, is proposing a connection between epistemology and ontology. And I came about this topic of ontology because every time I read something critical of technology and critical of media, usually the approach is ontological, and usually they would pose technology as some fundamental category in ontology. So it's not the human or what makes the human human, it's more about there is technology first, and we are shaped by technology. But the way technology is described is usually a way where there are no phenomenal characteristics accessible to human. When I followed Kevin about the neural fingerprint, this is one characteristics of my problem. So if we describe technology as being made up of very, very microscopic processes which we cannot access via perception, and which dominate us in our actions and our thinking, we have the problem that there is no point for us where we could enter with our critique, because it's detracted from us, detracted from our experience. So my account will be to criticize this kind of ontology and to say that we need an account of experience with the technology to be able to criticize it in a viable way. So I'm going to start. In my short paper, I will echo some tendencies in the current debate on big data, standardization, and alternative conceptions of post-human, human, post-human entanglements with the digital. My aim is to reflect on the debate. I will not present another theory. Rather, I want to gather hints on how the concept of the body and with it experience vanish in two directions. On one hand side, there is the specter of big data, which dissolves human or living beings in numbers and other storable data. The possibility of gathering and using huge amounts of data does not only pose risk for losing privacy, it also is an approach towards living beings that slices lives in digestible data. This is an essentially non-living approach. On the other side, critical approaches also seem to work with concepts that leave the body and its experience behind. Underlying this move, we find reasons to do so. Most importantly, all the dichotomies criticized by gender and queer theory. Still, critical theories also have a tendency toward disembodiment, or they propose settings that are not open to experience. For example, accounts of technical or media a prioris, for example, Bernhard Stiegler, or in some points also Mark Hansen. Their embodied experience is detached from its constitutional conditions because they are thought of being technical and hidden from experience because of their complexity and microscopic structure. I will propose that we should refine our idea of the phenomenality of technology in order to get a grip on how we are entangled with it. So why are the concepts of embodiment experience so important? I will lay emphasis on the concept of embodiment because it gives rise to experience and has a temporal component, processual aspect, which is important. Embodiment, I will argue, is central in the critique of big data and other forms of media standardization because it preserves the dimension of experience of first-person qualitative conditions. Experience is a concept that is systematically neglected in the gathering of the third-person data. Also, the second-person perspective, which is relevant in empathy and all forms of interaction, does not figure within the context of data. So in my next few steps, I will try to explain why I think we need accounts of embodiment and experience within critical approaches toward big data and other forms of media standardization. Some of you might remember on last year's discussions with Brian Masumi and Aaron Manning. Their concept of movement is quite peculiar, which kept me thinking about it. Instead of developing a concept of movement from something that moves, a body or a subject or whatever entity you can think of. They suggested to turn movement into an ontological category of its own. The aim was to find an alternative concept to subject-driven agency. Agency has, in their view, two problematic implications. It involves a strong subject and a form of self-transparency of the subject's intention. Both of these features neglect the heterogeneity involved in the constitution of subjectivity as well as in the formations of intention. Karen Barrett phrased it like this: existence is not an individual affair. This is what we subscribe to, at least since phenomenology started to emphasize the role of the other in constituting the self or the relation of a subject and object. It has been starting point for theories on relational ontologies. What is there are not entities, sets of categories, or substances. Ontology has become a theory of entanglement and relation. In the course of this theorization, bodies became constructs, self-dissolved into narratives, or neurological fireworks, and physical entities may consist of quantum states. So with relationality, it is a concept central in ontology. We need to see what is implied by this concept. In the following, I will draw on Maurice Merleau-Ponty's concept of an indirect ontology, because it is an account that constitutively integrates phenomenality and has been a source of inspiration for many participants within the debate of relational ontology. First and foremost, relational ontology is an account that does not draw on substances as basic categories. Relations become constituents of what there is. If you look at Maurice Merleau-Ponty's late writings, relationality might not be the best term to capture what he wants to say. He rather speaks of an indirect or intra-ontology because he wants to avoid the idea of the objective space. Intra-ontology. Objective space has two connotations which represent a dualistic worldview. One is the idea that the world can be grasped from outside, from the perspective of a cosmotheorist, or the other way around, that the cognizing subject itself is situated within an objective space. Both perspectives keep up the ontological gap between the subject and the object. Merleau-Ponty proposes an ontological account from within the very texture of the world, or what he calls the flesh. The flesh is a concept that stands for universal palpability, or in German Empfindsamkeit. The German term is more general, it doesn't focus on touch, rather it encompasses all senses. He builds his ontology on perception, or rather on the omnipresence of the sensible and the visible. Seeing, according to Merleau-Ponty, implies necessarily being visible, being from the same flesh as the visible world is. In using the term flesh to characterize a different ontological approach, Merleau-Ponty stresses the aspect of living, of phenomenality. The concept of the flesh captures the fact that subject and object are not pre-given categories, but emergent qualities in the thickness of the world. The epistemological consequence of this ontology is that being within the world, or being entangled with an environment, is constitutive of cognition. Cognition does not work from a vantage point of view, rather, it is a modulation within the fabric of the world. That means that the cognizant subject has been and constantly gets shaped by its environment. To explain how subjects relate to their environment in a deeper sense than just being situated within an objective space, Merleau-Ponty uses the term chiasm or chiastic structure. As I said before, perception is a fundamental category in his ontology. That is why Merleau-Ponty develops all structural differences from the basis of perception. In his late writings, he uses the terms visible, invisible instead of perception, because he wants to express a generalized account of perception, which is not tied to the perceiving subject. The paradigm of visibility as a feature of the perceiver as well as the perceived, the chiastic structure becomes more clear. Seeing is always being visible. just as touching means being touchable. These two sides are like two sides of a leaf. They cannot be separated. We can see because we are visible like the objects we perceive. We see from the midst of everything, or even more important, the chiastic structure also holds for the self. Just like touching something is always being touched, there are self-directed movements involved. In perception, the perceiver always perceives him or herself directly or via perceived objects. Speaking of perceivers and objects does not quite capture Merleau-Ponty's original idea that in his ontology everything is always in a state of becoming, of emergence. Objects and their qualities are salient features of a complex structure of perspective and entanglements. Merleau-Ponty presents an ontology that implies time and process because differentiation emerges from primordial non-difference. All differentiations are to be seen as modulations from a state of non-difference. Relationality in the concept only comes about when there is life and hence self-movement. These very basic forms of subjectivity are important for Francisco Varela, who takes Merleau-Pontian framework as starting point to explain life as a continuity from most basic unicellular forms to most complex life forms. But already in Merleau-Ponty, such biological perspective is well known. The whole ontology is driven by principles of life, and nature is defined as a chiastic structure of the visible-invisible. Heterogeneity is always rooted into the texture of being, and so is phenomenality. The experiential aspect is central because the flesh stands for the generalized, sensible or the Erfindbarkeit, and it is drawn from the concept of embodied experience. Let me now turn to the question of media and ontology. Ontological accounts in the wake of Merleau-Ponty are often linked to the term ecology, whereas nature is not the primary subject. Ecology, as a term of post-media critique, is used to denote medial and technical environments, as in Timothy Morton or Erich Hörl's accounts. Or nature and technology are thought of as a continuum, as in Donna Haraway. Timothy Morton puts it the following way in his blog, Ecology Without Nature, I quote, "When you realize that everything is interconnected, you can't hold onto a concept of single, solid, present-at-hand thing over there called nature," unquote. And Erich Hörl says in 1,000 Ecologies, I quote, "Relation must be understood as something that precedes the forming of the terms of the relation, as for example subject, object, individual groups, indeed all forms of collective human or non-human agents. Predominantly it must traverse all modes of levels of being, from the micro to the macro, meaning that it is a modality of being," unquote. This description is in line with Merleau-Ponty's ontology. It also suggests becoming of the terms of categories. The question is why nature turns into a negative concept whose place is to be taken by technology. The predominance of technology in our life world has an immense impact on how we conceptualize the world. Authors like Bernard Stiegler, for example, stress a technological a priori, which means that human cognition is thought of as constituted by technology in a very broad sense. Given the omnipresence of the technology and technological rhythms, it is more than important to ask how human minds and cognition are shaped by technology, and more so if we promote a relational ontology. The presence of technology must make it different when everything is related, and relation is ontological primary to its terms. Still, the primacy of technology within media philosophy or post-media approaches is one discourse which contrasts directly with another scientific field, the neuroscientific discourse. This discourse is extremely technology-driven, but the image of the human that is presented here is directly linked to the concept of nature. The human mind is conceived of as epiphenomenon of underlying world processes. The embodied cognitive subject is reduced to complex non-conscious activity. What I wanted to show up to this point is that there is a range of ontological theories which all are more or less connected to Merleau-Ponty's thinking, but tend to negate concepts such as nature, identity, or the body. This is interesting because in Merleau-Ponty, the lived body is absolutely central, and as I tried to show by elaborating on the concept of flesh, the idea of life as a continuum cannot be neglected in this theory. Nevertheless, from a critique-oriented perspective, it makes sense to be suspicious of the categories such as nature or the body. But to the other side of the theoretical spectrum, the neuroscientific discourse, we are confronted with a strong take on nature and biology that dissolves the embodied experience into neural activity, which also means the phenomenality of first-person perspective have no explanatory function, at least in standard cognitive science. Both the question of the ontological status of technology as well as sciences of the brain establish entities that lack phenomenal qualities. They are seen as constituents of consciousness but do not relate to its fundamental structure, which is the first-person perspective. Next question would be, what do we gain when we make these theoretical shifts from nature to technology, from embodied experience to relationalities, from subjects to agencies? With big data on the horizon, technology looms larger than life over our heads. All the hidden and open surveillance cameras, thousands of small clicks on the internet that basically every human in industrial countries produces each day. Tiny traces that would form an eerie version of ourselves if collected and put together like a puzzle. There is a huge fascination in producing images of ourselves in forms of data or selfie. Running through the woods, you are never alone. Your Facebook appears cheer for you, your Nike community challenges you. But all these data do not belong to the individual, they are fed back into the net and go wherever. The user does not know, still it's fun. The digital culture could be described as an element rather than a separate part of the life world. It is woven into the air we breathe, into the foods we eat, and it inscribes itself in our movements and perceptions. To make sense of what the entanglement of the digital does, it is useful to grasp the dimension of it. And this is why we tend to prioritize technology in our ontological accounts. I will try to use a bird's eye perspective here and look at the larger context of this theoretical move. The roots of relational ontology lead us back to Merleau-Ponty. His central topic is perception. The primordial world does not know of distinct categories of subject-object divides. The terms of the relation, as Pearl pointed out, emerged only with the relation, not prior to it. All features are emergent and hence open to be specified. This is the part where in history of thought, the miracle happens. Technology enters the picture. Simultaneously, the human subject vanishes from the theory because it is seen as a symbol of the technology of the self, of power and repression. And this is not what I'm arguing against. The subjectivity Immanuel Kant describes always seemed way too transparent to be true. Still, I will argue that in theorizing the role of technology and the digital, we need an account of experience and therefore what it means to be embodied. What is needed is a concept of experience that meets the contemporary state of the theory. That means we do not need a strong subject that stands in opposition of the world, and therefore we do not need a concept of the world or nature that is that thing over there, as Morton put it. Relational ontologies, ecologies that center on our technology are an answer to the question, what is the core driving principle of our life world? Attempts to transcend what is human in this theoretical setting has the problem of centering on the human consciousness in the premises of the theory. If technology is seen as an ontological primary to experience, then we speak of human perception, of human consciousness, because from an ontogenetic perspective, technology emerges with higher forms of consciousness and immediately, but I would argue not prior to, starts shaping the mind. For example, measuring time alters our perception of time. To understand this report with technology over the ages, it does not take us very far to cancel out experience. Then the qualitative dimension gets lost in theorization. Karen Barat says in her essay on touching, I quote, "Thinking has never been a disembodied or uniquely human activity." I couldn't agree more. Looking at the diverse theories, I see that categories of embodied experience are used while there is no account of how these features could be discerned in sensory experience or possess a certain phenomenology. That holds for Masumi's concept of movement, for Stiegler's technical a priori. Even the standard neuroscientific approaches cancel embodied experiments. In all of these cases, phenomenality is transcended by a more complex micro or microstructure. The same happens with big data. We talk about huge amounts of third-person quantitative data. The collection of these data follows its own algorithm and logic. It is masses of data, and these data are subjected to various interest-guided and organizing interpreting principles. It is impossible to say what individuals become in the light of those data. They essentially lack quality or embodied experience. This is the point where a concept of phenomenality and with it an embodied subject needs to be established that is neither self-transparent nor opposed to an objective, spaced, nor ideological loaded. To deal with the problem of homogenization by big data in digital culture, we should develop tools to describe phenomenal features in order to get a grip on their existential impact. Bodies can be altered, experiences enhanced, but they should not vanish in the void of theory or data. Phenomenality is a decisive feature in our experimenting with different technological settings as reflected here in this project. To interact with technology means experiencing within complex environments which are not out there, but all around us and inscribed in our living systems. And keeping an eye on the phenomenality of embodied experience, it is much easier to see how technology and nature merge within a texture of being. Thank you.